Hey, y'all. I'm always really excited to talk about any part of US history. In fact, so excited that I try to tone it down so you guys don't think I'm nuts and crazy. But when it comes to the Cold War, I can't contain the crazy. It is by far, to me, the most fascinating and interesting period of all US history. So you'll just have to forgive me today. I can't contain the excitement and try to act like a normal person when talking about this time period. Part of the reason I find it so interesting and important is because of the way it still has such a profound effect on our world today. So, kind of keep that in the back of your mind as a prelude to the thesis for my case study today. Before I get into the case study, I want to address three questions that will kind of lead into my thesis for this lecture. The three questions are going to be around, real briefly, what caused the Cold War, then was it a real threat? Like, did we maybe inflate the threat of the Soviet Union and communism? I'll answer those really quickly. And then the third question I want to look at is why we eventually won the Cold War. And as I do all of those, I will lead into the case study where I will get into some information that's new, that's not from the textbook. And I will make a very firm argument and thesis about the Cold War that will hopefully help you understand why I think it's so important in understanding our lives today. All right. So, first things first, history, we're always talking about cause and effect, right? So, what are the causes of the Cold War? This is one that I can do perhaps most briefly. And that is, it's kind of two-parter here. First, there's a lot of tensions with Russia coming out of World War II. Remember, we didn't have a lot in common besides our mutual hatred of Germany. And because the Russians had done the majority of the fighting against Germany, they felt like they had the right to dictate what the world would look like after the war. And the US didn't like the way they envisioned the world because, and this is kind of part two of the causes, the US and the Soviet Union had totally different ideological uh, perspectives on how the world should look. So the Soviet Union believed the world should run according to a kind of communist government, and the United States hoped for a democratic framework for the world after World War II. So these ideological differences are really what drove a wedge between the US and their former allies from World War II. So that very briefly is the causes. Some of that will become more clear as we dive deeper into this. But the second question that we can cover real quickly is, was this a real threat? Like, so the Soviet Union envisioned a communist kind of government for themselves, and they're hoping for that for countries around them. But like, is that really a real threat? Was it worth all the hysteria and drama on the part of the US during the Cold War? Well, here's where I think it's important to look at popular culture again. Remember that we covered this last week for our course reader article about World War II. We really looked at the ways in which Americans interpret the past through popular culture. And I want to encourage you all to think about how much your concept of the past, in this case, the Cold War, really is informed through popular culture. So, like, what do you all know about the Cold War beyond, what maybe you do remember from some textbooks and history classes? I would make a bet that most of it, your knowledge of the Cold War comes through the James Bond movies, or maybe movies like Hunt for the Red October. And honestly, sometimes you might not have even been conscious as a child that it was about the Cold War, but those things are insidious and they kind of seep in as this unconscious understanding that we have. And then when we do explicitly hear something about the Cold War, we filter that explicit information through the unconscious understanding that we already have. And I think so much of that comes from popular culture. So for many of us, and here I'm kind of lumping myself in with your generation, even though I might be a bit older, it's from kind of more recent popular culture. And I think for many of our parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles who are older, they're interpreting it through much of the pop culture of like the 50s and 60s, which really painted the Soviet Union as a terrible threat. It was called the Red Menace. The Red Menace was actually a movie made during this time period, portraying what was perceived to be the kind of shocking horror of what composed the Soviet Union and the fact that it might invade our country as well. So, like, okay, but does popular culture get it right? Well, I do want to argue that there was a real threat here. I know some of you might have been waiting for me to be like, oh, communism, not a big deal. Like we didn't need to be afraid of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. No, it's actually not where I'm going today. Surprise, twist. I want to remind you of just the first like 10 pages of the textbook chapter for this week. And let's put this in one snapshot, just to kind of remind you of the ways in which the threat of the spread of communism was real. The United States wasn't making that up. And there were real reasons to be afraid of that spread. There were reasons why the US had more than just a kind of like tactical interest in keeping the communists from spreading. And like there was some really, really like problematic ideologies being spread with the Soviet Union as well, from the perspective of an American, is how I'm framing that. So first, is it a real threat? Like, was there real escalation? Absolutely. So just think about how fast this happens. And, I know that like our world today is sped up and we're kind of used to things happening quickly. But like even by our time scale, this is a fast escalation. So immediately after post World War II, Russia established puppet governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. That means like in name, technically these are sovereign independent countries, but really the Soviet Union's, pulling the strings behind the curtain. And these are, communist countries run by the USSR. By 1948, Russia had supported a communist coup in Czechoslovakia. Then in 1949, China becomes a communist country and signs a treaty with Russia. That was really shocking to the world. And that same year, Russia successfully tested their first atomic bomb, the very thing that we kind of supposed would maybe kind of cause the Soviet Union to like pull back on the reins, just because we always had that threat over them. But that was no longer the case by 1949. In 1950, communist North Korea, aided by the Soviets and the Chinese, invaded American-backed South Korea. So it's spreading, right? Like this is not an unfounded hysteria or fear on the part of the US. And then just one last reminder here, a lot of us, when we start to think about Vietnam and the Vietnam War, we put that way into the 70s. We forget that's a part of the Cold War, and it's deeply rooted in the first moments of the Cold War. So in the early 50s, China, Russia gave aid to rebels in Vietnam who were trying to kick out US allies, and then the US itself once our allies left. All right, so it's on the spread. It is a real threat. But the question I really want to address is the third one in my lineup here, and that's why eventually the US won. So I've just briefly kind of covered, what gets us into the Cold War, the causes of it, like, is it a real thing? Do we have something to be worried about? And then lastly, why we won. And jumping to that third question might seem kind of odd because it's like, jumping to the conclusion of a story before really like understanding the heart of the story. So I want to acknowledge that it is an odd approach, but I think at the end of this lecture, you'll understand why I'm taking this approach. So we will get to the heart. We're just starting with the conclusion for a very specific reason. All right. So I'm going to argue that part of the reason the US won, actually the main reason the United States won the Cold War was because of democracy. So it's a very different argument than the one I made for World War II. Remember, I kind of laughed and used my grandpa as an example of, an older generation that thought we won World War II because democracy is better. And I and other historians really argue, actually, it's just the United States could outproduce our enemies. So this is hoping to highlight for you the very dramatic ways that the Cold War is different than any other war the US fought and has fought. The Cold War is much less about resources and who can outproduce the other, in terms of like keeping an army in the field and keeping troops, fed and clothed. Like the Cold War, why we call it the Cold War? Because there were very few actual hot outbreaks of conflict. And so the Cold War is more of an ideological war about which kind of government and which kind of political culture would win. And I'm going to argue in the end, the United States ends up proving democracy is a stronger, more resilient kind of culture. And it, I think, helps explain why we won the Cold War. So I'm making a distinction here between these two different kinds of political cultures. For the US, I'm claiming that our democratic culture was resilient, flexible, pragmatic, and capable of balancing multiple interests at the same time. In opposition to that, I'm going to try to illustrate and claim that communist culture was dogmatic, brittle, inflexible, and demanded a single interest. And for those reasons, the US ended up being more stable. And this explains, I hope I'm not spoiling this story for any of you, but you do know like communism crumbled in the Soviet Union in 1989 through 1991. And so I'm looking back from that historical hindsight and asking why ultimately was the US stronger? Okay, so I'm going to give a little evidence here that helps support this broad, kind of abstract, generalized claim that I'm making here for the differences between our two countries. And I do want to acknowledge, like, I'm really starting out through the lens of the United States versus the Soviet Union. But of course, the Cold War becomes much more than that. And pretty quickly here, you'll start to see me pull in China and then other countries as we continue for the next couple of weeks to talk about the Cold War. All right, so some evidence here. Well, I want to start by first talking about a couple of US politicians that were in charge of various places around the world that had previously been controlled by our enemies during World War II. And once we won the war, the US came in and kind of built temporary governments to get these places back on their feet. And I want to contrast the style of leadership and the kind of political culture that developed in these places as a contrast to the kind of political culture that develops in the Soviet Union. So let's look to Germany first. This is General Lucius Clay. At the end of the day, y'all, I don't really care if you remember his name or not. You can just remember kind of the general broad strokes of the story I'm telling here. So in your mind, just think, okay, in West Germany, the US got, partial control over it, and we're trying to get it back on its feet. And we want to create a stable political culture there, a stable government. And so what do? Well, we build a new government kind of in the image of the US government. And it's up to this general to ensure that that happens. So we call these kind of military / civilian occupations after periods of war. And this was never with the intent that the US would continue to occupy these countries long term. That was not the idea. We wanted to simply stabilize them and return them to self-government, but in the model of US self-government. Okay, so Clay is the military governor of West Germany after the war. And you might think because he's a military official, he would probably run West Germany with more of a kind of military bent of mind, maybe, through a kind of dictatorial rule. But instead of doing that, which he could have done, what he did was he committed all of his time and resources to reviving the economy of West Germany and then transforming them into democracies. This was his explicit intent and goal. Transform West Germany into a stable democracy. So two examples of how he did that are maybe kind of surprising. Again, this is a military dude. He's not a politician. One example of how he really tries to instill a kind of democratic culture was he not just allowed, but encouraged the German press to review and criticize his policies. He could have, as a military governor, limited the German press access to his government, for example. And he could have limited their ability to write critiques of what he was doing in the daily newspapers, but he didn't do that. Because in a democracy, freedom of speech and freedom of press is incredibly important to a stable democratic culture. In addition to this, General Clay invited members of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to come to Germany and review his policies to ensure that he was indeed really adhering to the basic ideas of civil liberties, of freedom of the common person, and rule by democratic majority. So that's Clay in Germany. Let's look at his counterpart in Japan. So again, a territory that the US temporarily occupied after the war with the intent of kind of returning it back to sovereign rule by the Japanese. So Douglas MacArthur, again, another general who fought during World War II, he became the military governor of Japan. Long story short, does the same thing that Clay did in Germany. He pushed for universal suffrage. He helped create and encourage a system of parliamentary democracy, and he pushed for women's rights, not just the right to vote, but other kind of like civil liberties for women in in Japan. And the thing I want to emphasize here is that no one demanded or told Clay or MacArthur to do this. This was not a top-down imperative for the president, for example. It was simply a part of the culture they were raised in and steeped in and educated in. And it just made sense for them to rule both West Germany and Japan for a couple of years according to the principles of democratic culture. So I want you to compare this kind of brief introduction to both Clay and MacArthur. And if any of you know MacArthur more, and you might, he was a very famous general from World War II, what he did in Japan after the war might actually be surprising in comparison to the way he ruled as a general in the army. But again, he sees kind of civilian government as something very different than the military. Okay, but let's compare these two to leaders of the two emerging communist countries during this very time period. And that's Joseph Stalin. And in a second, we'll talk about Mao Zedong from China. And you see, it's a useful comparison here because these are both kind of emerging new political cultures. In West Germany and Japan, it's a kind of new form of democratic culture being encouraged there. And in the USSR and in China, this is, kind of on the heels of a political revolution there. And the new emerging culture is a communist culture. And I want you to compare their styles of leadership and then think about whether my proposition that one kind of political culture is more stable and flexible than the other, consider whether that's a true argument or not for you. All right. So for Stalin, when we're talking about like democratic political culture, I can be brief. I can use kind of like abstract examples and principles for you all because most of us were raised in this culture and we know what that means when I say women's rights or universal suffrage or parliamentary democracy. Those are deeply meaningful things to you and it conjures up specific things in your mind. For Stalin and Mao Zedong, I want to focus on kind of the core of what their political ideology was in terms of communism. And the core of that was an economic policy. It's like, that's really, really what it came down to in terms of like how they defined communist culture. So for Stalin, the term for his economic policy was called collectivization. That's kind of the heart of political communism for him. And I'm going to show you a brief quote from the person who I think is probably the best historian and scholar of the Cold War time period. I will show you in a couple of slides here after I quote him a couple of times, the source. His name is John Lewis Gaddis, and I'll show you the book I'm quoting on. But again, he's a historian of the Cold War era. And I think he captures kind of the best for me, and I think for you all too, he captures really quickly what effect collectivization and kind of communist culture had on the country. And I think really helps illustrate why this is not a stable kind of political regime. So this is John Lewis Gaddis. He says, By the end of the 1930s, Stalin's agents had arrested or killed some 63,000 opponents of collectivization. So again, collectivization is his kind of core political / economic policy. It defines communism for him. By 1932, his agents had deported over 1.2 million kulaks, this is Stalin's term for wealthy peasants, to remote regions within the USSR. By 1934, at least 5 million Ukrainians had starved to death from the resulting famine. Stalin then began purging government and party officials, producing the imprisonment of another 3.6 million people and the execution in just 1937 to 1938 of almost 700,000. These included many of Lenin's surviving associates. Y'all remember Lenin, kind of a precursor to Stalin? Even though they shared some ideology, his associates were not really welcomed by Stalin. And this historian goes on to say that one person, Leon Trotsky, kind of escaped Stalin's regime by going and hiding in Mexico. But then he says Stalin then hunted down and murdered Trotsky in 1940. So like it was so important for him to stamp out all dissent. He would even follow like one person across the world just to ensure that he was murdered. And then the historian I'm quoting goes on to say, by this time, one historian has estimated that the Stalinist dictatorship had either ended or wrecked the lives of between 10 and 11 million Soviet citizens, all for the purpose of maintaining itself in power. So I hope my comparison here is apt and useful for you all. Again, I'm trying to get you to wrap your heads around how do different political regimes gain power and maintain power. I want you to see the differences here between two Americans who are put in charge of two countries where they're trying to implement democratic policies, government, and cultures. I want you to compare that to two communist leaders who are trying to implement their style of government and culture. And I want you to think about which one to you seems to be the most stable, the most flexible, one that would have lasting power. Let's do a quick comparison of Russia to Mao Zedong and China during this time period, because you might be thinking, well, that's just an exception, right? Like that's just Stalin. That's just the USSR. What about communism in other places and other communist leaders? Well, the same historian, John Lewis Gaddis, in this really expansive book I'm quoting from, I'll show you the reference in a second, he basically says the same thing happens in China. And his critique here is of Mao's economic policy called the Great Leap Forward, essentially his version of Stalin's collectivization plan. And John Lewis Gaddis says the result of Mao's Great Leap Forward was the greatest single human calamity of the 20th century. Stalin's campaign to collectivize agriculture had caused between 5 and 7 million people to starve to death during the early 30s. Mao now sextupled that record, producing a famine that between 1958 and 1961 took the lives of over 30 million people, by far the worst on record anywhere ever. And then finally, at the bottom, you see here the source that I'm quoting. John Lewis Gaddis, in this book called The Cold War: A New History, takes a kind of collective estimation of the effects of communism worldwide during this time period. And again, what I like about his perspective is he really considers communism as an ideology, as a way of thinking about the world, and then how it translates into a political culture. And I would be hard pressed to find one of you in this class, I think, who would disagree that and say like, oh no, like this form of political government and culture seems more stable than democracy. I think most of you are on board here, right? So Gaddis sums up this way. He says, Marxism and its successors, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, they can't be judged on their economic performance alone. The human costs were far more horrendous. These ideologies, when put into practice, may well have brought about the premature deaths during the 20th century of almost 100 million people. The number who survived, but whose lives were stunted by these ideas and the repressions they justified, is beyond estimation. There can be few examples in history in which greater misery resulted from better intentions. So I hope you see here, Gaddis is not trying to decry the intentions of the people here. And actually, I know from other readings, he's actually quite sympathetic to some of the ideas of, say, Marxism or Maoism. But that's not what he's questioning. He's looking at the actual results. And then he sums up this way. He says, the sign that went up on an East German factory wall just after the Berlin Wall came down was entirely appropriate, if long overdue. To the workers of the world, I am sorry. There hardly needed to be a signature. So I hope you all recognize that reference, right? It's Marx, it's Karl Marx, kind of the originator of the ideas of socialism, that then people like Lenin and Stalin turned into their communist ideology. So again, he's not maybe, he's not maligning the intent of these individuals, but talking about how when put into practice, these ideologies are not stable. They don't work, especially in comparison to democratic culture. So again, the whole point for me here is to get us to think about why eventually the United States won the Cold War. We can make an interesting quick detour here and look at Nikita Khrushchev, because you might be like, but Stalin, he's a terrible dude, right? Like, it's not communism, it's just that he's a dictator. Well, here's an interesting contrast. Stalin died in 1953, so during the time period that we're looking at today. And when Khrushchev came to power, he was very critical of the style that Stalin used to rule. Khrushchev did not want to be a dictator. And he gave what later became called his de-Stalinization speech to the worldwide communist gathering shortly after Stalin died. And in this de-Stalinization speech, again, imagine this, he's standing up in front of all the leaders of all the communist countries in the world at this point in time. And he gets up and says, here are all the terrible things that Stalin did. Can you imagine that? Like, just like critiquing very recently head of the Communist Party. In fact, this was so surprising. There's this story. I don't know if this is like actually true or not, but I love telling this story. That apparently the leader of the Polish party who was there, when he heard the speech, he died shortly afterwards from a heart attack. So it's a dramatic story. Maybe the dude just had a bad heart. I don't know. But the fact that people connected those two things, I think, is pretty significant. That, like, the speech was shocking enough that people could legitimately suspect that if a person had a heart attack, it was because they were shocked by what Khrushchev said about Stalin. So what Khrushchev tried to do when he came to power was humanize communism. He tried to make it not about dictatorship, but ultimately he couldn't resolve its contradictions, and he ended up doing the same thing that Stalin did. I want you all to look at what happened in 1956 in Hungary as an example. So Hungary took Khrushchev at his word. They're like, okay, cool. So you're not going to be a dictator. You're not going to micromanage. You're not going to tell all the other communist countries around you what to do. Cool. We want to leave the Warsaw Pact, which is this agreement with the Soviet Union, where basically the Soviet Union told everybody else what to do. And they're like, we don't want to be a part of that pact anymore, and we're going to be a neutral state. We're still communist, but we don't want to be controlled by you. And Khrushchev's response was, oh, crap. That's not really what I wanted anybody to take from my de-Stalinization speech. And what he ended up doing was sending in troops. And after 3 days, he had successfully put down the Hungarian revolt and killed 20,000 Hungarians. Right? So you start to get the sense when a communist leader wants to be flexible and allow for individuality and some, some difference of opinion amongst the communist leaders, suddenly when they're actually pushed to test that in reality, they just can't bring themselves to accept that. Even the alliance between the Soviets and the Chinese crumbled by the 1960s. And I want you to think about the fact that this didn't happen between the US and our allies in things like NATO. And that's not because we didn't have disagreements with one another. But I want to argue here again, like democracy really matters. Because we and our allies were democratic countries, we had different ways of solving disagreements. A great example is with Eisenhower in 1956. I love using Eisenhower because he's a former military official, someone you might think like might be apt to use power and control when being president, but actually he really fits and defines the ideals of democracy. In 1956, remember you read in your textbook about the Suez Canal crisis, and our allies, France, Great Britain, Israel, attacked Egypt because Egypt was trying to nationalize some of their resources. And when our allies attacked Egypt, the United States didn't think that was a great idea, and in no uncertain terms told them to withdraw. And they did. And our alliance remained unaffected. We could disagree and come to a kind of compromise without dissolving our alliances. And I want to argue that with the ability for us to do this was because not a single one of our leaders in the United States or in the Western world thought that they were the personification of their state. So think about that. Like Eisenhower, is he the personification of the United States? No, he's simply a public servant elected by the American people to represent them. He himself is not the US. He's not the state. Did Clay behave that way? Did MacArthur behave that way? No. And that's such a contrast to Soviet leaders like Stalin in particular. Stalin does not see any difference between himself and the state. He is the state. He's the personification of it. So, and that happens again because, right, that like in a democracy, you can't think of elected leaders that way. And so elected leaders tend to be much more receptive to thinking about public opinion and learning how to compromise. So this is, again, going back to my claims about like democratic culture is flexible. It's pragmatic. It can hold multiple interests. And you compare that to Soviet culture or communist culture or Chinese culture under communism. I'm sorry, I want to be really clear here. I'm not making any kind of judgments about ethnic culture here. We're talking about political cultures. And under those communist political cultures, you have inflexibility, you have dogmatism, you have the lack of ability to compromise. And I think eventually that's what undermined communism in places like the Soviet Union. All right, so I want to give you a specific example of what I'm talking about here. We're looking at kind of general examples here, like I've gone through this pretty quickly. And I'm also really focused here on Europe and Asia. And I want to give you a little more specific examples of one particular case, one place in the world, and it'll shift our focus a little bit to South America. We often tend to skip over South America when we're talking about the Cold War, but I think this example is going to really drive home my argument here for my case study. And at the same time, it also reminds you that what we're trying to do is stop the spread of communism, which means we're not just trying to contain it in Europe, but we're trying to ensure that it doesn't spread all over the world. Okay, so let's look at a specific example that will hopefully illustrate for you the differences between democracy and communism. So what you see here is a picture of Jacobo Arbenz. And this guy was deposed by the United States government, by our CIA in 1954. He was the leader of the country of Guatemala. 1954, Arbenz was deposed by a US orchestrated coup. He was kicked out of power. So Guatemala in 1954, right in the heart of these early Cold Years periods. So I want you to think about now, given what you know about the context of the Cold War and this early history, make a guess here. Why do you think the United States organized a coup to depose him in 1954? And again, remember, he's the leader of Guatemala. Well, a little history might help you here, if in case you're not up on Guatemalan history. Just kind of three basic periods I want you to jot down in your notes will help you kind of understand what's happening here. Guatemala's history, kind of the earlier history, was marked by a period of Spanish colonialism. That was in the 1500s, and it's really no different than the Spanish colonialism that any of you have ever studied in any other parts of the Americas. So the indigenous people were controlled through Spanish colonialism up until the 1820s, when eventually the Spanish were kicked out. But in place of colonialism, a system of land feudalism developed where you had things like serfs and indentured servants. So that was in the 1820s onwards. So yes, Guatemala gained independence from Spain, but really the system of government and the economy didn't really change at all. Then about a couple of decades, a century, several decades later, in the 1930s, many of the feudal landlords were kicked out of power by a series of military dictatorships that ruled Guatemala. Okay, so now knowing that, that was kind of the 1920s, 1930s, by the 1950s, this dude's in power. Why do you imagine the US would come in and depose him? Well, I am guessing that most of you are thinking, well, it's the Cold War. This dude was clearly a communist, a dictator, perhaps. And the United States saw that as a threat to our stability. Like, here we have communism spreading to our southern borders, right? Like, that is a big threat in the midst of the Cold War. Well, actually, no, you're wrong. I know I set you up for that. But I can guarantee you that every single time I have told this story, and I imagine for much of the future of my career, when I tell this story and I let people guess why we deposed him in 1954, everybody always assumes it's because he was a communist. He was not. Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically elected president of Guatemala, and the US came in and removed him. Why? Like, why would the US depose a democratically elected president in the midst of the Cold War? Aren't we supposed to be spreading democracy? Wouldn't we be thrilled to have a democratic president in places like Guatemala, where we're trying to gain allies to fight against communism? Well, there's just a tad bit of backstory here that I purposely skipped. So in between the 1920s and 30s, when the series of military dictatorships took over in Guatemala and the election of Arbenz, there was a revolution. In 1944, the Guatemalan people rose up, and these are largely indigenous people, and said, enough is enough. We are tired of centuries of exploitation. And they overthrew the military dictators. And that 1944 revolution was a democratic revolution. And for the first time in their history, the Guatemalan people voted, and they instilled a president to serve their interests. And it was this dude, Juan Jose Arevalo. He was the first democratically elected president in Guatemala's history. So that was 1944. He served I think he served 2 terms before a new round of presidential elections in 1951. And he ran up against Arbenz. Arevalo lost, and Arbenz became president. That's how democracies work. Usually, like, it's really easy for a democracy to last through the first president. And then that president's like, ooh, I like being in power. And then quickly it devolves into a dictatorship, and they refuse to give up power. But that didn't happen. Like Guatemala successfully passed through its first major test of whether it could remain a democracy. They had a peaceful transfer of power after the people spoke and said, we no longer want to support Arevalo, and they voted in Arbenz. So again, why would the US come in and depose Guatemala's second democratically elected president? Well, okay, here's where the Cold War does matter. You were right in your first instinct to think this has something to do with the Cold War. It certainly does, but just not quite what you might imagine it does. So let's think about what Arbenz had done as president in the first couple of years before he was deposed in that coup in 1954. Jot down two things in your notes. One is something called the Land Decree 900. I don't care, honestly, if you remember the specific name. Just remember, it's a land decree. It's a policy about land. It was passed in 1952, and Arbenz supported this. It's a government policy that stated that farmland currently held by foreign corporations will be redistributed to the people working that land. So that's the Land Decree 900. It's the redistribution of farmland to the people who are actually working it. So the peasants, the indigenous people. And it was taking that land out of the hands of foreign corporations. So you might start to smell a whiff of something here. Maybe that's a whiff of like, is that socialism, right? The government coming in and taking land out of the hands of the landowners and giving it to the people. Like, that's pretty much like the definition of socialism and maybe communism. And it's more than a whiff. But I want you to keep thinking about this story. Stick with me. Don't make any judgments yet. I want you to think about who these foreign corporations are that own this land. Jot down in your notes the second thing. It's the name of the foreign corporation that owned the vast majority of land in Guatemala. That corporation was called the United Fruit Company, the UFC, not the Ultimate Fight Club, but the United Fruit Company. They owned, I can give you exact statistics here, but I don't want to do that because it'll boggle your mind. So I'm just going to round off. The UFC owned almost 50% of the farmable land in Guatemala. One foreign corporation owned almost half of the farmable land in Guatemala. Guess where this foreign corporation came from? Like, you guys know this, right? This is a US corporation. And they're making boatloads of money in Guatemala. How did they get that land? Why does a US corporation own almost half the land that's farmable in Guatemala? Well, because they made a series of dirty deals with dictators in the couple of decades preceding the 1950s. Basically, they told the dictators, we'll help support you in your power and exploitation in this country if you help support us. So oftentimes, and just so you all know, this is not just Guatemala. This happens all over Central and South America in the early 1900s. The US corporations do this all over the place. Generally, how this worked was the corporations would come in wielding lots of money, lots of capital, and they'd be like, hey, dictators, wouldn't it be nice if you had some better roads in this country? And so they would offer to use their capital to do things like build infrastructure in return for the dictators giving them ownership of land. And the dictators didn't really care. They're like, cool, why not? Like, this helps, aid our country's development and it helps our economy. And, we don't care. It just lines our pockets. But what overall this, what created was basically it forced peasants to labor for really, really cheap labor. Because, of course, none of these governments, none of the dictators cared about, protecting the labor rights of indigenous people working for these US corporations. And because the corporations gobbled up most of the farmable land, it wasn't possible for peasants to sustain themselves. All right. So now do you have a better understanding? Like, I know this is going to make you so cynical, and some of you are just like rolling your eyes in disgust right now. And I get it. I know the feeling that you're having right now. Just connect the dots here. In 1954, the United States government, our CIA, secretly backs, orchestrates, and promotes a coup, a deposing of Guatemala's democratic president, because that democratic president tried to take land away from a US corporation and give that land to his own people to work. All right, one extra layer here. Guess who the Secretary of State was during this time period? I don't know why you would know this. Why did I say guess? You shouldn't know. It's okay. I'll just tell you. His name is John Dulles. He was a Secretary of State. And for those of you that don't know American foreign policy and how it works, our Secretary of State is the most important person in this country in terms of creating foreign policy. So they would be the person making decisions like sending in the CIA to depose a foreign leader. That dude is John Dulles. He was Secretary of the State during the 1950s and while this coup happened. Guess what his relationship was to the UFC? He was a stockholder. So when Arbenz took land away from the United Fruit Company and tried to redistribute it to his own people, that hurt the pocketbook of John Dulles. So he had a vested interest in ensuring that Arbenz was deposed. Furthermore, John Dulles' brother, Alan Dulles, was a board member of the United Fruit Company. You all like follow the money. It's really stinking dirty here. I could go on and on and on about this example, but I'll wrap up by saying what ends up happening after Arbenz is deposed is a really horrific story. If like the coup wasn't bad enough for you, what happens afterwards is really gonna kind of clinch the deal, I think. What the United States then proceeded to do was back a series of brutal dictatorships in Guatemala. These dictators proceeded to kill tens of thousands of their own people while the US backed these dictators, because the dictators, again, were willing to go back to these previous policies of allowing US foreign corporations to use their resources in ways that benefited the corporations. And all of this is backed by official American policy. Okay, so I want you to just kind of pause here for a second and think about the fact you might be feeling a little bit of whiplash. And this is partly intentional on my part. Well, not intentional in the sense that like I manipulated you here, but I did set up a story that I knew would make you feel a kind of sense of backlash, of whiplash. So I started today's lecture by talking about the horrors of communism, the horrors of socialist policies when put into place in the economy. And then I said, let's look at a specific example of the differences between democracy and communism in a specific country. And then I gave you an example of what a democratic country, i.e., the United States of America, does to another democratic country when that democratic country puts into place policies that compromise the ability of American corporate capitalist interests, their ability to profit off of other countries' resources. So what I tried to do for you all here is set up a really difficult contradiction. And that contradiction is the ways in which democracy and capitalism are associated. So during the Cold War period, we started to conflate democracy and capitalism. Do you see how that happened in this story? Like, we assume that because we're a democracy, anything we do in the interests of capitalism is right, is just, and is good. But I want you to see how in Guatemala, you have an example of like, it's a democracy. That president is serving the will of the people. And yet he has an economic policy that's not completely pro-capitalism. And for that reason, the US thinks that we have the right to come in and destroy that democracy. So my thesis for my case study is going to take a kind of surprising turn here. And that's because there's complications up the wazoo during the Cold War. I was talking to one of you this week, Mike Stone, about the ironies of the Cold War. This is a period laden with ironies, and this might be one of them. Here on the surface, we claim to be protecting democracy, but in reality, what we're really doing is promoting capitalism in a way that compromises democracy. So that's my argument. That is my thesis for this case study, is that by trying to promote capitalism abroad, we actually damaged democracy abroad and at home. So ultimately, we still ended up winning the Cold War. And that is because I think we finally kind of came back around to recognizing the fact that it's first and foremost democracy that we needed to protect. And we're going to continue to have that discussion in coming chapters. But I'm arguing that at least during the early years of the Cold War, the 1950s into the early 1960s, we kind of lost our minds. We became hysterical, and we would do things that damaged democracy, both at home and abroad, in the name of protecting capitalism. So let me give you two quick examples here. I know that this lecture is going on pretty long here, so I'll start trying to wrap it up. One example of how we're damaging democracy abroad. Well, Guatemala, for one example, right? Like we depose a democratic leader and then support dictators for decades afterwards. Like that's a pretty damn good example. Another example, and this is where, again, the term irony comes to mind for me. Assuming most of you know this image, this is Che Guevara. He was a communist revolutionary during the Cold War period. But what most of us don't know is that Che Guevara did not start out as a communist. In fact, as a young man who was just trying to kind of, make his way in the world and try to figure out, like, who is he? What does he believe? He actually looked to the United States as a great model. And he was very open to considering the political ideologies and the economic ideologies of the United States. But turns out what we did in Guatemala ended up radicalizing Che Guevara. We turned him into a communist, the very thing that we were trying to combat. So by trying to fight the spread of communism, the US inadvertently ended up encouraging it in certain places. I could go into more details about that story. It's just kind of a general example that I encourage the rest of you to explore a little bit more. Essentially what happened, Guevara was in Guatemala City when the coup occurred in 1954. And he was so outraged by what he saw happening there and in Iran. You guys read about Iran as well in this chapter. He was so outraged by what happened that he then met up with Fidel Castro and his brother, and then they plotted the Cuban Revolution. We radicalized him. So that's just one example of how the US's kind of hysteria about protecting and promoting capitalism undermined democracy abroad and actually radicalized people that might have been sympathetic to the American cause. One other example I want to use here, and this is turning the lens back more on American society and culture. And as we do this, I want to think about the effects that this still has today on American society and culture. So I'm going to argue that not only are we kind of undermining democracy abroad, but we're doing it at home as well. And in this really kind of odd, peculiar way. So because we're so afraid of the spread of communism, we end up basically deciding every single policy in our country is good if it does the opposite of what the Soviets were doing. And then we decided if a policy looks similar to what the Soviets doing, that automatically must be a bad policy. So we stop making domestic policy according to democratic decisions, essentially, and we start making choices out of hysteria. I want to quote an American educator, writer, author, poet, Archibald MacLeish here. He was alive during the Cold War and a very astute commentator on what was happening. He made this famous statement. He said, American foreign policy was a mirror image of Russian foreign policy. Whatever the Russians did, we did in reverse. American domestic policies were conducted under a kind of upside down Russian veto. No man could be elected to public office unless he was on record as detesting the Russians, and no proposal could be enacted from a peace plan at one end to a military budget at the other unless it could be demonstrated that the Russians wouldn't like it. So I really believe everything that I said in the beginning here, that like there is reasons to be terrified of what the Soviet Union was doing. And I would not have wanted to live in the Soviet Union under, let's say, a Stalinist communist regime. But we lost our minds. We stopped being capable of thinking things through rationally. And instead of really thinking through, like, what are the merits of capitalism? What's the merits of this domestic policy? We just looked to Russia and we said, well, if Russia likes it, it must be a bad thing. So here's some examples. Foner went through these in the textbook chapter, and I just wanted to tease these out and highlight them. This explains why we started in the 1950s to oppose national health care and public housing. Y'all, that's not inherent to democracy. Like, I know so many of you just think like, oh, democracy can't be supportive of things like national health care, right? Those are socialist policies. Those are communist policies. No, they can be democratic policies too. And they were. Our country was headed in that direction until the Cold War. And because the Russians promoted these things, we automatically turned against them. During this very time period, we also started to associate Christianity with Americanism. So you can't be American, you can't be patriotic unless you're Christian. Why? Well, because the Russians did the opposite. It's not very thoughtful, you all. It's really reflective and hysterical how much of this transpired. Traditional defenses of gender roles and heterosexuality became associated with state-supported American identity and patriotism. Why? Well, because the Russians were open and accepting of different kinds of sexuality. And so we did the opposite. And labor unions, remember them, how popular they were becoming during the 1930s, during the 1940s? Guess what? Because Russia also supported labor unions, we turned against them and we purged their radical leaders and passed things like the Taft-Hartley Act. And what I want to point out here is how much, so much of this still defines American culture today. And that's largely because of the Cold War. Lastly, let's turn this to civil rights and race and racism in this country. Foner reminds us that the flourishing of civil rights legislation of the Truman era, as well as the 1930s, and that openness in American culture to different people during World War II, all that potential quickly closed down. And he reminds us that all the economic gains that Americans made in the 1950s were not matched for Black Americans. And at the end of the day, if you questioned any of this, you were accused of being disloyal. So let's get to the thesis for this chapter. And then I promise you I'm wrapping up here. And at the end of the day, I really want you to think about like, how does this still affect our country today? So the thesis for this chapter says, even as the freedom train reflected a new sense of national unease about expressions of racial inequality, its journey also revealed the impact of the Cold War. Originally intended to contrast American freedom with Nazi tyranny, the train quickly became caught up in the emerging struggle with communism. The freedom train revealed how the Cold War helped to reshape freedom's meaning, identifying it ever more closely with anti-communism, free enterprise, and the defense of the social and economic status quo. So what is he saying there? Kind of a summary of everything I just prattled on and on about in this lecture video. As we're fighting communism, all these other issues, debates about racism, debates about women's rights, debates about free enterprise, so capitalism unregulated versus the government ensuring security for people. Like all of these extra domestic debates that have been going on forever in our country, those become caught up in this debate about communism. And the freedom train is a perfect way of illustrating that. So many of you probably have no idea what the freedom train was. It was a really, really fantastically interesting example of the government trying to display for Americans in this really visible ways some of the proud parts of our past, of our heritage as Americans. And this started after World War II. And again, as Foner states, it was a way of trying to illustrate the difference between America and what we should be proud of and all the terrible things the Nazis were doing. So like freedom versus oppression. And the train was toured around the country carrying like displays from the Library of Congress of, like ancient documents signed by the founding fathers. And the train was painted in this patriotic like garb, like flags were displayed. It was a kind of cool thing where it would stop in train stations and major cities around the country and people could come on board and get a sense of America's past and freedom. This freedom train quickly, as Foner says, becomes caught up in the Cold War. Even though it wasn't supposed to be about the Cold War, eventually it was. And in the end, what actually ended up being on the freedom train were documents that in no way drew any attention to the troubled racial past in America. So they purposely cut out documents that were kind of provocative or radical, documents that might suggest that there's not racial equality in the 1950s. And that was because no one wanted to question the status quo. We didn't want to look bad in comparison with the communists. So the freedom train ended up becoming this kind of symbol of how the US is basically sweeping under the rug anything unsavory about our past and how that unsavory past affects the present. So Foner says, although we are making great strides during 1930s, 1940s in terms of racial equality, it's all dropped by the wayside during the Cold War. We don't want to confront it anymore because it makes us look bad compared to the communists. So holy crap, right? Like what a great comparison and kind of useful visual for Foner to bring up in his thesis. For me, this is really, really gripping, and it helps me understand a little bit better the ways in which the Cold War is redefining freedom and democracy. But yet, don't forget my thesis here is that, it's not a lot different than Foner's, but that like as we're fighting communism, which is, I think, a thing that I would have supported fighting, we also are damaging our own democratic principles at home and actually undermining democracies that could potentially spread abroad. Right? The irony. Okay, so that I know this has been a long video. Thank you for kind of suffering through the length with me. I am not doing a second video this week because your second reading is extra credit. So I wanted to pack everything together here at once. But ultimately, overall, I'm not asking you to do more watching of videos this week. It's the same amount of time I would do during a normal week. So thank you, everybody, for engaging with my excitement about the Cold War. I hope to hear more of your reactions as we continue over the next couple of weeks to study the Cold War all the way into the 1990s. All right, have a fantastic day. I'll talk to you again soon.